Hello and welcome everyone to another episode of This is Revolution podcast. I'm your host, Jason Miles, and I'm sure for the few of you that are watching this early, you're like, Jason, you're usually always late. Why are you starting early? Well, in honor of our guest today, Cedric Johnson, some time ago last year, Pascal and I were doing a video essay series for Zero Books when Doug Lane was still on there. Now that he's gone, we got a lot of the material back that we were using for Zero. And one of the things that we did for Zero was a video essay based on Cedric Johnson's essay about Huey Newton, the forgotten Huey Newton. Excuse me. Well, now that we have that back, we aired it on our channel probably a little early this year. That essay actually has a lot to do with what we're talking about today, the fetishization of the Black Power era. So before we bring Cedric in, we thought we'd start the show a little bit early, play the video essay so you guys can comment and we can actually have a conversation about this in real time instead of you guys watching the essay and then in comments, maybe we see it, maybe we don't. So that being said, let me get us started.
I'm Carl T. Rowan. As the new director of the United States Information Agency, I have the privilege to present to you a dramatic document of man's continuing search for dignity.
I plan to go on with our expansion and also to make even a stronger tie with the struggling people of the world, because they represent 2/3 of the people. The colonized world, or the developing countries, are also the colored world, and American imperialism is implicated in all of those puppet governments that control these developing countries. In other words, if America withdraws its support from Greece, that Greek regime will fall. If America withdraws its support from the puppet government of South Vietnam, the Vietnamese war would end. So what I'm saying is we have to hook up internationally. You can only understand the situation internationally, and in order to do this, that we are going to commit troops. We're going to commit troops to the Vietnamese people, the National Liberation Front, to fight the cowardly American aggressor.
Who's
the Black Panther Party.
In August 1970, Roy Wilkins, the sexagenarian leader of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, used his syndicated column to criticize Huey Newton for urging the formation of an all-black fighting unit to assist the Vietnamese National Liberation Front. Newton co-founded the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense with Bob Seale in 1966 and had recently been released on a technicality after spending 33 months in prison for the killing of Oakland police officer John Frey. Wilkins saw Black Power militancy as cynical and misguided. The Viet Cong may be hurting, Wilkins wrote, but nothing like the hurting of John Q. Black American. Of course, Huey knows about this suffering. It was the resentment over this treatment that led, at least in part, to the founding of the Black Panthers. But Huey, for all his talents, is also a revolutionary. Revolutionaries get confused. When he emerged from prison a month earlier, Newton addressed his supporters from atop the hood of a car. Wanting to bask in his newfound freedom, Newton took off his shirt, revealing a top frame, the reward of a punishing jailhouse regimen of push-ups. Young and defiant, he was the physical embodiment of the new militancy that contrasted sharply with Wilkins' graying demeanor and bourgeoisie comportment. And yet, in contrast to the popular image of the fiery Black Power orator, Newton was charming but soft-spoken, and his public speeches were delivered in a nasal, breathless tone and a more deliberative manner than the soaring rhetoric of his contemporaries like Eldridge Cleaver and Stokely Carmichael.
police are there not to, in our community, not to promote our welfare or for our security and our safety, but they're there to contain us, to brutalize us and murder us, because they have their orders to do so. Police in our community couldn't possibly be there to protect our property because we own no property. They couldn't possibly be there to see that we receive the due process of law for the simple reason that the police themselves deny us the due process of law. And so it's very apparent that the police are only in our community, not for our security, but the security of the business owners in the community, and also to see that the status quo is kept intact. When we first started, we had a police alert patrol, and we would patrol the community. If we saw the police brutalize anyone, we would put an end to this. Usually the police wouldn't brutalize anyone if we were on hand because we were armed, and if the police arrested the individual, we would follow him to the jail and bail the individual out, whether he was a Panther or not. And we would gain many recruits like this. So therefore the community started to say that, well, these people are really concerned about our welfare.
In his response to Wilkins' accusation of misplaced priorities, Newton defended the party's domestic survival programs: free breakfast for school children, free health care clinics and sickle cell anemia screenings, free clothing and shoes, loans to welfare mothers, and bus trips for the families of prison inmates. Newton charged that Wilkins' criticisms reflected his obvious class interests and identification with the ruling circle, and belied his commitment to a reactionary internationalism, namely his support for Israel. Black people in America have long been affected in a negative way by America's war of imperialism, Newton wrote. We are internationalists because our struggle must proceed on many fronts. While we feed and clothe the poor at home, we must meet and attack the oppressor wherever he may be found. Newton's withering critique of Wilkinson's ideological capitulation and hypocrisy came at the height of the Panthers' popularity. In a few short years, the Black Panther Party had grown from a local organization created to confront police brutality on the streets of Oakland and Richmond, California, to, as Students for a Democratic Society put it, the vanguard of the Black Revolution, and in the eyes of Federal Bureau of Investigation Director and arch anti-communist J. Edgar Hoover, the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. If the Black Panther Party was the most iconic organization of the Black Power era, Newton was easily its most popular, recognizable figure. The early propaganda photo of Newton seated on a wicker throne with a carbine rifle in one hand and a spear in the other captured the spirit of the age and continues to haunt popular memory and lore of the 1960s, decades after he was gunned down at only 47 years of age during a drug dispute in 1989.
Basically, the whole black nation has to be put together as a black army.
Like the broader movement he gave birth to, Newton's life was at various turns inspirational and tragic. Following his release, Newton struggled to integrate back into party life. The international campaign to win his freedom had made Newton a powerful symbol of the organization, but in many ways the party had outgrown his command and others vied for influence beyond the Bay Area. The combined weight of heightened police repression and his own paranoia fueled Newton's addiction and reprehensible behavior. His rhetoric and political courage inspired thousands to stand against war, racism, and imperialism, and yet at other moments he succumbed to personal acts of brutality and self-destruction. Newton's political formation came amid the new nationalist militancy of the early 1960s, but the primary period examined here is a brief historical window, a mere 6 years from the establishment of the party in 1966 to Newton's pronouncement in 1972 that the party was putting down the gun and finding ways to work within the American system. This time frame also corresponds to the birth of Black Power as a political slogan and the consolidation of radical and moderate forces around black ethnic politics at the 1972 National Black Political Convention held in Gary, Indiana. The year 1972 also marked a critical turning point in the Cold War, with Nixon embarking on a diplomatic visit to Mao Zedong's China, beginning the process of normalization between the two nations and foreshadowing the turn to liberal economic reform under Deng Xiaoping.
Good morning. It is 7:30 p.m. in Peking. President Nixon has been in the capital of the People's Republic of China for some 9 hours now. He has already met with Chairman Mao. The president went to Mao's home for a talk that the White House described as serious and frank. That's all we know about it. With me here in New York is Dr. Jim Thompson of Harvard University. Dr. Thompson has lived in China, so he knows a great deal more about it than the rest of us. What significance do you attach to this early meeting with Mao, Jim?
Frank, I think it's a very significant development. It underlines the deep seriousness with which the Chinese view this trip. It's unusual to see the chairman that early. It's unusual to see him for an hour. This is no pure ceremonial occasion. There is deep substance at work.
Yes, well, the talk described as serious and frank. That in itself indicates that they really got down to business.
I would suggest so, yes.
Yes. Well, at this moment, of course, President Nixon is due to be attending a banquet.
Tonight, the dinner in the Great Hall of the People. That began with several rounds of handshaking and formal pictures, and many courses of China's best food, and apparently relaxed small talk between the Nixons and Premier Zhou, the host. And then Zhou went to the microphones for his toast.
The social systems of China and the United States are fundamentally different. And there exist great differences between the Chinese government and the United States government. However, these differences should not hinder China and the United States from establishing normal state relations. We hope that through a frank exchange of views between our two sides, to gain a clearer notion of our differences and make efforts to find common ground, a new start can be made in the relations between our two countries. In conclusion, I propose a toast to the health of President Nixon and Mrs. Nixon, to the health of our other American guests, to the health of all our friends and comrades present, and to the friendship between the Chinese and American peoples.
This period is one of the most celebrated by historians of black radicalism who venerate the Panthers' left internationalist politics. There is a willingness to openly criticize the liberal bourgeoisie politics of black elites, the misogyny and sexism of black radicals, as well as the essentialist and escapist elements of black cultural nationalism. But the left internationalism of the Panthers and other tendencies is typically sparred from critique. Newton and the Panthers deserve to be studied and debated because so much of their analysis and political practice address ghettoization, racist policing and incarceration, mass unemployment, and failing schools. Problems that define the urban crisis of the 1960s and have grown more intense and graver in our own times. But while I am sympathetic to the historical project of left internationalism the Panthers embodied, I want to offer a critical analysis of some of the central ideas offered by Newton that were at times widely shared among black power radicals and continue to shape left approaches to U.S. inequality. Newton's political ideas evolved from a formative nationalist period where he and other black radicals embraced concepts from decolonization struggles to a more speculative left period after his 1970 release from prison, when he offered more original approaches to thinking about American empire and potential paths to socialism. Whereas the former period grew out of his experiences in Oakland's black ghetto and were organized around the pursuit of black national liberation through armed self-defense and serving the people, the latter period was shaped by the expanded platform Newton gained as a celebrated political prisoner and focused increasingly on a notion of socialist revolution predicated on popular control of the forces of production. These transformations in his thinking were also undoubtedly influenced by the process of black political incorporation that was unfolding across the nation. The concomitant expansion of the black professional managerial class and hyper-segregation of the black urban poor would spell the end of the black colony as a geographic reality and as a central thematic of black political discourse. The colonial analogy was powerful as a means of connecting both the second-class citizenship endured by blacks and the grim human toll and social contradictions produced by American commercial and military power abroad, made so visible by counterinsurgencies and coups d'etats around the globe, from the Congo and Indonesia to Cuba and Vietnam, actions orchestrated by the Central Intelligence Agency to undermine left populist movements and destabilize socialist regimes. As Newton discovered, however, such attempts to transpose modes of thinking born in the colonized world onto the advanced industrial context of the United States could not pinpoint the specific political and economic manifestations of empire that Americans faced on the domestic front, nor deliver an analysis that might have united black and white, suburban and urban, unionized and non-unionized, waged and unemployed, into a counterpower capable of transforming American society. Newton came to terms with the limitations of the colonial analogy and offered precious insights regarding the unique problems facing Americans who would oppose empire from within, but he reached these fresh conclusions just as the social struggles of the 1960s were entering a phase of demobilization.
Where did you see the Black Panther Party headed by the end of '68? At that point, you're in prison. You've been convicted. Seal is under indictment. Cleaver is out of the country. What did you think? What did you think was going to happen?
Well, again, that I wanted to emphasize the community development aspect of the party. We were at the time that we were just creating we were planning our creation of a community school. We were having busing programs to prisons where we would pick up community people and take them to the various penal institutions. I felt that we should turn away from the arms because too much had been made of them, and I thought that the arms had served their purpose as far as being a catalyst to gain enthusiasm of the community.
But what did you think was going to happen? I mean, were you aware that the federal government was on the Panthers' tail at that point?
Oh yeah, I was very well aware of that. Was one of the reasons that we didn't want the.
I'm sorry, if you could just rephrase.
All right. During the period of '68, '69, the federal government had declared all-out war on the party, and they were breaking into headquarters across the chapters, breaking into chapter headquarters across the country, and filming weapons and saying that, look, they have guns. It was never mentioned that the guns were legal weapons. They were doing everything to make the community afraid of the party, and of course you can't organize when people are afraid of you. So I was inclined to try to develop more local politics, to run local members for various offices, and develop our 10-point program, which was a housing and food and health program.
thank you guys for watching that with us. Can't wait to hear you guys' comments on that when we bring Cedric in. If you are new to the channel, please hit like, please hit subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell, as we are constantly adding new shows to the channel, new programs, and we do things like this, where I decide to start 10 minutes early and play a video essay so we can have a deep dive conversation about this topic. Also, I want to remind people, go check out Deutsche World. It's DW on YouTube. Pascal was featured on there recently on a news story they were doing about Jamaicans and reparation. And also, if you don't check it out, every Monday, Pascal and I are on the David Feldman Show. And we usually do a small 30-minute segment. And this past Monday, Pascal was on there doing the segment solo. So let me bring in my co-host, my homie, my dog. He is the man of the Mau Mau Hour. He is the Pascal Robert.
Peace and greetings to the chat. Peace and greetings to the audience. Peace and greetings, Jason Miles. Hard for me to realize you are in Mexico because you look like you're in like Alaska.
It's a little chilly. We had a storm here last night. My daughter arrived safely, so Junior is here. She's resting.
That's what's up.
We're hanging out in downtown Rosarito, and then took her to another city not too far from here, and we had a late lunch. It's a wonderful thing to get to hang out with your kid. So she's enjoying Mexico. So this is a wonderful day all around. We get to hang out with our boy Cedric, who never comes on the show because he's always so busy writing some important thing. Hey Cedric, can you? No, sorry, doing something important. Can't fuck with y'all right now. Why don't you call Teray? I can see Ced chuckling in the green room. Well, let's get to it. This is an important show, and time is of the essence. In a moment when the divide between the elite and the poor and working class is becoming more cavernous, the government continues to turn a blind eye to the plight of the people still negatively affected by COVID and its economic aftermath. Many look to the past for leadership guidance. Decades after its demise, the Black Panthers are still the avatar for domestic civil unrest. But are the politics of Black power enough? Is revolutionary rhetoric, just that and nothing more? We'll ask these questions with Professor Cedric Johnson. He is an associate professor of African American Studies and Political Science at the University of Illinois, Chicago. We often cite his book, Revolutionaries and Race Leaders, on the show, and he has a new book out. Provocative title, just to let you guys know. Generally, we'll find out the truth here. Authors don't have that much of a say-so in the title or the cover art. But maybe Cedric had more say-so, we don't know. The Panthers can't save us now. So, please welcome the Cedric Johnson. Good evening.
Brother Cedric, Comrade Cedric, my man, 50 grand, Cedric Johnson. You literally looking like you just walked in from Studio 54 and dancing. I don't know what's going on with that look you got there, man. You look like you was like listening to the Bee Gees or something, man. What's going on?
Right. Hey, man, it's great to be here.
Glad you're here.
I want to say this. So I've been bugging Cedric over the last week. The moment, I wouldn't say the moment this book came out, but when there was a date for the book, we talked about bringing Cedric back on the show. And when the book finally was able to, be available to the public, Pascal and I got copies, and I kind of lagged on reading it. And as soon as I opened it, I devoured it because it definitely was fitting in with something that I'm writing and working with. And I'm constantly hitting Cedric up. I'm like, man, you don't understand, brother. Like, I'm working on this thing right now, and everything you're saying is coming right out of what I'm working on. And then there's something in this book that I found rather interesting, and I don't know if this was something you wanted to do. If so, I think it's really interesting. But you have dissenting opinions about the essays that you wrote in this book. Was that a you decision or was that an editor decision?
So yeah, let me just say again, thank y'all for having me, and thanks for the video essay. You know, as I was watching that, I was like, man, you make it sound better than it did on paper. I just got to tell some of my people not to watch that when they tripping on shrooms. That might not be a good exercise, you know. Giving some of those visuals. Yeah. So as far as the book, right, that book was born out of a symposium, right, and the symposium included different essays. It was originally published in New Politics, and you know, there were people who were invited. I should say there were many more people invited to participate than the ones who were actually published. And so 3 of those essays appeared in the original symposium that was published by New Politics, Jay Arena, Touré Reed, and Maya White. And then they continued to publish a few other pieces that fit within the same frame or responding in some way to the Panthers essay that I wrote for Catalyst. And so Kim Moody's essay was one of the more substantive and longer pieces that was published by them. And so those were included. I mean, they needed to be included. And that was my decision, right? I should say also that this book was originally published by a group out of Madrid called Libros Corrientes. They approached me about just publishing the Panthers Can't Save Us Now essay. And when I told them about the other essays in the symposium, they were like, well, we want to translate these into Spanish and, you know, publish it as a book. So the Verso book, in some ways, it grew out of that original project that was published last year.
Okay, that's dope. But I did really enjoy reading some of those dissenting opinions. Definitely, you guys could probably tell I was reading them a little late in the evening. Because I knew I had to get up early to pick my daughter up from the airport, and I couldn't really sleep with nervous excitement. And nothing grounds you more like frustration and anger. And I definitely felt that reading some of the dissenting opinions. But Pascal has posed some fascinating questions because your book definitely is centering around a lot of what we're talking about of late on this show. And it hasn't aired yet, but we had a wonderful discussion with Dr. Joy James. And definitely I believe I quote, if I didn't quote you, I definitely mentioned your name in that discussion and this current book that we're talking about too. So Pascal, you want to fire off?
Absolutely. You know, Cedric, you know, it's always a pleasure whenever I get a chance to interact with you on the phone, through text, or on the show, because you are, you know, actually one of my favorite political scientists. You probably know all the other ones that I like, and you probably know most of the ones I can't stand, because they probably similar in that regard.
Right.
But one of the things I've always appreciated, man, is that you are you have an encyclopedic mental Rolodex of all various, you know, nooks and crannies and crevices of Black history, political thought, political history, intellectual history. And I always, whenever I had to do any project at all, and you say, you know, Pascal, this is good, that means a great amount of stuff to me, man, because I know how much you take this seriously, more seriously than many people should. So I'm really going to start off with a basic question that I think is going to get us off to a really good start. Many people, even scholars, have an idea of the Black Power movement that is rooted in militant posturing and challenging the system with revolution. Can you define what you mean specifically by the Black Power movement and explain why the actual political goals and nature of the movement were much more conservative than many people realize.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, man. So thanks for the kind words, man. I really appreciate that. Of course, I'm also a fan, right? So we can engage in some mutual fandom. It's odd that I appeared on the show when it was only Jason, and then I knew you through other circles, right, and through the Black Agenda Report. And so to see you two join forces, is just such a perfect combination, right? I don't want to go too far with a comic book reference of some dynamic duo, but I just think it's great to see you two join forces and to be the voices that we need, right? The kind of programming we need at this particular moment that does these deep dives. So yeah, thank you for the kind words, and I return everything 1,000-fold to you as far as the energy. So in talking about Black Power, here's where some of the confusion begins, right? I mean, Black Power was a term that was used by all sorts of different people before '66, right? It was a term that was used as the title of a book by Richard Wright when he traveled to newly independent Ghana. It was also a term that was used by people like Adam Clayton Powell in some of his speeches in the early to mid '60s. Many authors on the pages of Liberator magazine used the term Black Power. And of course, people within SNCC were using it in many ways in relationship to the campaigns they were staging in places like Lowndes County, Alabama, right, where you had, Black people in a numerical majority in some of these Black Belt counties, but at the same time, completely powerless and unrepresented in terms of formal government. And so we should start from that, right? That it always was a phrase that had different meanings for different speakers, for different audiences. And it's when Stokely Carmichael popularizes a chant, which he didn't invent. It was actually invented by Willie Ricks, another member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And when he popularizes that during the 1966 Meredith March, right? James Meredith was shot in ambush as he was taking a solitary march from Memphis down to Jackson. When he's shot and his protest or his march is taken over by SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and SNCC, it's in a moment when there's already debate, within these organizations about their future direction. There's impatience. There's conflict between clergy and different student cadre in the movement. And so when the phrase becomes popularized, immediately, right, it's condemned by the more conservative elements within the civil rights mainstream, right? So as Malcolm X would call them, the big six, in particular, Roy Wilkins, who was no fan of Black Power from its very beginning, would condemn it. And other people, of course, even King would try to distance himself from that concept in the immediate moment. The problem, again, is that it's a slogan, right? And so what does it mean? It speaks to a certain sense of disenfranchisement that many people still had at that particular moment. But it's not until, when Carmichael and Charles Hamilton begin to pen and give a sense of their operational definition of Black Power, that we really get to see what it was all about from the very beginning, right? So I think, there's a way in which it's evocative, right? And there was a particular kind of response from whites, in particular, people who were afraid of Black Power as some form of Black domination, who had a problem with it. But in its operational form, what it came to mean basically was Black integration into the institutions of governance at the local, state, and national level. And I know some people might say, well, that's just a particular wing of the Black Power movement. But by the 1970s, I mean, across the board, even the Black Panther Party would engage in electoral forays. And so I think we should be clear about that. Part of what precipitates Black Power's popularity, even among blacks, is the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which opens the door by restoring black voting rights, opens the door for black political participation across the country in the South, but also in urban areas in ways that were impossible during the during the Jim Crow period. And so there's always rhetorical edge to it, but underneath it, it is about, really pursuing the path of ethnic group incorporation that many other groups had pursued beforehand. And I think once we take away the rhetorical flourishes and the most militant rhetoric, that's essentially what we're left with, is how do you take control of governing institutions, but also economic institutions and others in your immediate communities.
How do you exactly, I'd like to talk about that, because some would argue that the ultimate goal of the Black Power movement was encapsulated in the Black Panther Party's 10-point program. Some would say that the ultimate goal of Black Power was self-determination of the community. I always find it interesting when I hear people say self-determination. Well, what part of the self? Is Clarence Thomas part of the self? And so, you always say self-determination as well. And some people say that control of the internal colony, or believe that black people are an internal colony, or things of that nature. Or some would say that the goal was to revolutionary overturn the capitalist imperialist state. How exactly do you respond to those kind of various positions or arguments some would make in terms of what the true essence of Black Power was, as opposed to what you're saying is that when it comes down to it, it was basically a call for a black version of ethnic patronage politics?
Right. I mean, for all of those different, manifestations you just mentioned, I would say it was all of that, right? That is part of what gave it its vitality, right? Is that in the wake of, these various successful desegregation campaigns in the Deep South, in the wake of major civil rights legislation, there's a tremendous amount of efficacy among Black publics across the country. And this is something we gotta, again, think about the particular context, right? I mean, we lose sight of this in so many more recent or contemporary discussions. There's a tremendous amount of efficacy. What I mean by that, many people now believe that their efforts matter, right? That their political organizing can matter. It can change things. It can, if you dial back a decade, people probably did not think that not only would Jim Crow as a set of institutions be dismantled, but they would also be, maybe not as confident that you would see mass protests against an American-led war, right? Think about the 1950s. Who would have anticipated not only the civil rights triumphs, but also the protests against the Vietnam War and what that meant for the transformation of the society in some ways. So I would say to that person who wants to point to other things as more essential, all of those things were a part of the tumult, right? And the debate that was happening at the time. And part of it grows out of that sense of efficacy. So many people now believe that they can create an organization that will address the issues in their immediate context. The Panthers, of course, are the ones that everybody focuses on, and that we can thank, many white leftists in some ways for that. But there were many other organizations, a lot of Black nationalist organizations, cultural nationalist groups, a lot of local groups who may not have defined themselves in such strict terms, who presented their own visions of what they wanted in their immediate surroundings, but also what kind of society they wanted to live in. And so I think, my sense of it is that there is dynamism. There's all sorts of different, positions that are being taken. But there's also, this overriding institutional pressure, right, to move in a particular direction. And I think this is where many Black radicals and many contemporary folks who study the Black Panther Party or the Black Power period tend to go astray is to not think about that broader context and what it meant for what will become Black power in operational terms, right? So you not only have, the major, civil rights legislation that again cracks the door open to Black participation in a way that wasn't possible before, but you also have in the form of the Economic Opportunity Act and the War on Poverty, massive investments in cities and the doling out of grant funds that would go directly into the hands of many people who were activists at that time, well-positioned activists, who would later go on to become the first generation of Black elected officials across the country. Many people who we don't typically associate with the Community Action Program and War on Poverty initiatives. I mean, people like Bobby Seale even was involved in a Community Action Program initiative. Kenneth Gibson, who was the first, Black mayor of Newark, New Jersey. Many people, during this period were involved in this kind of federal intervention, where they're trying to provide local communities with funds to solve their own problems, right? To use the term that's coined by, used by people like Daniel Patrick Moynihan, they wanted maximum feasible participation of local communities, right? And even though they talked about Black communities as being essentially poor, the folks who would lead these community action programs, again, were the most well-positioned, right? People who already were either coming out of the civil rights movement, coming out of labor activism, but folks who were already at least partially initiated into the world of formal politics, right? But even if they weren't so initiated, this would provide them with a way to really begin to build a base, right? And make it even more significant forays. So to all of those people who talk about the essence, right? Again, you can talk about what particular tendencies you feel are important in the Black colony, revolutionary nationalism, whatever else. But there is this overriding, institutional investment coming from the federal government on down for more Black integration into American public life. And that ultimately becomes what Black power is, whether, we anticipate or desire other things or not.
So basically you're saying is that, ultimately what ends up happening is that the mechanisms that existed with the government largesse coming out of the Johnson administration in the Great Society created a kind of incorporation of radicals within the movement infrastructure into the normal kind of quotidian day-to-day aspects of governance and policy. And as a result, regardless of how radical the rhetoric or discourse or posturing or actual program may have started in the beginning, it basically ended up kind of becoming a political participation type of agenda around the fact that members were being incorporated into state apparatuses as a product of anti-poverty policy that were coming out of the Johnson administration. Is that a correct way of kind of framing what you're trying to explain?
Yeah, and I would just add, because I would hate for somebody to hear us talking about this and imagine that there's still some authentic grassroots Black politics that was lying elsewhere, that's left behind or excluded from the process. I mean, there's a lot of pressure from Black constituencies, right, to get to see people in power, right? So there's also from the very bottom, this is not just about, elites being bought off or co-opted is a phrase that many people use and abuse, right? But rather there's organic pressure, right? Many people across the country really feel that if they're able to elect Blacks to office, if they're able to, and this, Carmichael and Hamilton say this, exactly. I mean, I don't have the direct quote in front of me, but they literally say that if you can elect a Black person as sheriff, in a place like Lowndes County, you won't have as much police brutality, right? If you can elect people, to important governing institutions, if you can get majority city councils, there's a possibility that you can, create more in the way of jobs programs or other kinds of anti-poverty programs that might actually be effective. So, and this doesn't just start in the 1960s. We can go back to campaigns in places like DC and even Atlanta, where people, fought to get more Black cops hired, right? Because they actually thought that if they could have more Black police officers working the beat, that for one, these officers would be able to distinguish between
good and
Blacks
bad.
who are troublemakers and Black folks who are law-abiding, right? And so this idea that, African Americans in their own spaces wanted more Black representation. This is not something separate, right? Or outside of the picture, right? It's very much a part of this process of political incorporation, but it's of course it's fraught with all sorts of contradictions, right? So once we get into the first and second wave of these regimes, we begin to see, right, the contradictions clearly, right? We begin to see that, in a place like Gary, Indiana, Richard Hatcher admits that he cannot address the kinds of concerns or demands people have for jobs because he is not U.S. Steel, right? U.S. Steel occupies that particular role and exercises a tremendous amount of power in a place like Gary. When we get to other cities like Detroit and Coleman Young, Coleman Young brings down the hammer on people who are committing crimes in a place like Detroit, and really engages in the same kind of law and order policing, expansion of the police department, aggressive tactics, and pretext stops that we would associate with later regimes like Giuliani. But people like Coleman Young he's doing this in the 1980s as the democratically elected representative of Black people who comes out of the trade union experience, right? So again, it's those contradictions, right? That Black people wanted these things, given the sense of what their interests were in the 40s and 50s and 60s. But once these regimes manifest, right, and you do have in most major cities Black mayors, as well as Black-led city councils, right, you begin to see the real interests at play.
Well, can I raise you this? Right now we have a situation where there's a Black woman that's looking to go onto the Supreme Court, and there seems to be an automatic, and of course this isn't much of the scuttlebutt here where I am in Mexico, but what I see in the wide world of the internet, there seems to be an automatic backlash at a lot of Black people in power. Does it feel like there's almost a hero psychosis that a lot of us get into when we get figures into elected positions, that we don't really see the entire situation for what it is? To your point about the mayor in Gary that says, hey, I'm not the steel company that just got out of Dodge and took all those jobs away. I can only do so much. We've talked about this a little bit on the show. Maybe you can get into it. Both of you can get into a little bit more in depth. But when a lot of these Black mayors were getting elected, this is at the same time where a lot of these Black mayors are getting elected into deindustrialized cities, where the job base is leaving, the tax base is leaving in the urban areas, and it's really, really hurting the communities. And a lot of the programs are starting to leave as well.
So absolutely, right. You've got that contradiction from the beginning. My best source on this article I assign, religiously, from semester to semester, is Adolph Reed's The Black Urban Regime: Structural Origins and Constraints, that really lays out exactly what Jason just described, right? That there is, built into the birth of post-segregation Black urban regimes, this situation where they're being expected to balance a very high needs, high expectations, electoral constituency of Black neighborhoods and precincts, against the needs of the city more generally, which require catering to capital, right? Because we know that one of the things that these mayors realize, and all of us realize from the 1970s onwards, is that capital is mobile, right? It can go to different places, but cities are not, right? New York can't move to find jobs. It has to spend time incentivizing corporations to move into their jurisdictions to hopefully, produce jobs. So the overriding logic from the 1970s onwards, in the midst of, capital flight and manufacturing decline, is to increasingly try to subsidize, right? To use public coffers and incentives to attract investment, right? And this happens through, tax breaks, land grants, waiving labor laws, waiving environmental regulations, all sorts of things to seduce and lure investment back to cities. And Black mayors play an important role in this, right? And this is where I'm frustrated, when I read certain articles and just online commentary where people assume that Black elected officials are somehow powerless, right? That they don't really play a significant role. And I would argue in response that they actually play a role that white elected officials cannot play, in that they're able to cement popular support. They're able to secure popular support, oftentimes for pretty dreadful things, by virtue of the kinds of racial appeals they're able to make, right? There's plenty of examples of this, right? Where we see that, Black elected officials are able to say things and do things that others would be reviled and rejected for saying, right? And I guess the case of Coleman Young, is one good example, where he's a Black mayor who's very powerful, who is very, crass in some ways. If you read like the biographical background and some of the things he said while he was in office. But, the thing about it, he had people that were loyal to him. He had, people who helped to get him elected who were loyal to him. He had certain neighborhoods that were loyal to him. And you got to wonder, would a white mayor have been able to push for law and order type policing in that context, where you still had an energetic Black public and, Black publics in a place like Detroit? Would a white mayor have been able to accomplish that during that critical transition from the civil rights period and the ending of Jim Crow to the full rollout of neoliberalism as we know it, right? So I just think, again, Black mayors play a role in terms of securing consent from Black publics in ways that whites cannot. I mean, the greatest example of this, of course, is Barack Obama, right? I mean, here is somebody who, rises to power, or at least is elected, rises to acclaim at the precise moment when many people are increasingly skeptical about capitalism as an order, right? So think back to the Katrina disaster, which rattled people's faith in American institutions, reminded people of deep inequalities that existed in the society. A few years later, we have the subprime mortgage crisis, which was already beginning, I should say, even in the midst of the Katrina crisis. The subprime mortgage crisis and the Great Recession, Occupy Wall Street. We can think about all of these different events. We can also throw in, the murder of Oscar Grant in the Bay Area, right? So all sorts of different events where people are openly challenging the legitimacy of capitalism as an order, right? And at least talking openly about deep inequalities in ways that folks have not in a long time. And Obama enters into that particular breach. He's a figure who comes in, a symbolic representation of America's longer history of racial segregation, of slavery. He's somebody who has enough of a command and gesture towards New Deal liberalism that he entices so many folks. But in the end, he is deeply committed to the maintenance of the capitalist social order, right? He is deeply committed to these things. He is somebody who has an antipathy towards, old school state interventionism of the type that we associate with the New Deal. And so, Obama, is one of these figures who, again, is able to pull people back in towards supporting the society as it exists, right? One last thing I'll say, this wasn't just true for, people who are already liberal leaning. I mean, I was in the room with people who considered themselves Black radicals, folks who had demonstrated histories of activism, who wanted to get into a shouting match with me, during Obama's first election, because they were so adamant about seeing this man win and becoming the first Black president, right? I mean, it was shocking to be in that position where, I'm talking to people who I have deep respect for, people who, one figure in particular who had been involved in major marches, here in Chicago with King, right? But was pretty adamant about Obama as a figure. So I think, long response, but the key point is that Black elected officials can really play that role. Whites cannot. And I think we need to be clear about that.
Well, the Black, listen, Cedric, you're familiar enough with my work and our work here, where the Black political class and problematizing the Black political class and getting people to understand that we have a Black political class and why there is a Black political class and the role that they play, and the fact that they basically function as social control agents at the behest of the ruling class on the ruling class's agenda, and usually to the detriment of the masses, is something that is beginning to slightly penetrate the political imagination of, I would argue, two categories of Black folk. Blacks who are online often, and I would also say working class Blacks who have been so damaged by these policies that they fundamentally have lost faith in the political system. But the problem is that there is the Black petite bourgeois or Black professional managerial class who control the ideological superstructure of Black politics through churches, teachers organizations, Black institutions in the Black communities, that every election cycle perpetuate this ridiculous fealty, oftentimes to the corporate faction of the Democratic Party. And what you're finding, from my personal and humble experience, is that these people do not want to let go of the symbolic representationalism because it validates and vindicates them. It validates their presence in the overall corporate capitalist hierarchy of their various professions, and it vindicates them from the abuse that they get from their white coworkers, because they can say, look, my president is Black. We're running things now. And not to make it seem like the discourse is that reductionist, but in many levels, that's actually the motivating binary. I'd like you to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with the broad outlines of what you just described. I just think, so that's the criticism, right? That's the common thread, I think, that binds a lot of the work that we all identify with, we all share. This particular way in which, the empowerment of a certain segment of the Black population, definitely has had the effect of squeezing out, silencing, marginalizing other kinds of voices, right? At the same time, I would still argue, and this would be where I would want to add more in the sense of contradictions, right? And contingency, right? there's a place where my politics are anti-capitalist. They're not necessarily always anti-elite in the sense that I see elites as always occupying the same social role, right? So if we think about the civil rights movement, I mean, there are people who clearly constituted elites within the Black population who, in that moment, even as people deeply committed to a bourgeois, democratic politics, played a role of a progressive social force, right? And so I think that would be where I would add maybe a bit more in the way of contingency and contradiction to the discussion, right? I still think there's some Black elected officials in certain moments, in certain contexts that can play a progressive to radical role. And even with the Democratic Party, I mean, I think there's a way we have to shuttle back and forth between the broad condemnation of, new Democrats and the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, and how the Democratic Party is experienced at the local level, at the grassroots, right? I mean, in some places, especially where I grew up, the Democratic Party is the only game in town, and for some Black people, even now, in South Louisiana, where I grew up, many of these folks still, they're committed to the party. They see it as a vehicle. There's some moments when the Democratic Party is better than the other option, right? Especially in a place like Louisiana. And so that would be the only place I would try to connect, the broad argument that you made that I agree with, that critique, but with how it's experienced, and some of the contingency within it, right? That I do think, I wouldn't completely write off, all Black elected officials as playing the same particular, role of social control all the time. We know that there's moments when, they actually play a progressive role, in particular kinds of contexts, right? And I mean, that's just the way that I tend to think about politics, that it's always shifting, the context is changing. Maybe one good analogy would be if you think about, the game of football. I know we're out of football season now, but
it's never out of football season.
Right. That's what my head and heart still is.
you stopped that foolishness, brother. It's football season year round with me.
Absolutely, man. So I guess the way I would talk about, there's roles that all the players have to play, right?
Yes.
But over the course of a season, we know that people can shuffle in and out of roles, right? That people can, somebody can get benched. Somebody can come off the bench and become a star overnight. Somebody who has high expectations on them can be a complete failure. And so I just think that there's that dynamic at play that we just have to be aware of and talk about. It doesn't cancel out the broad criticism, but I just think
I want to address that specifically because you
hold on, Pascal. We got to. We're over an hour.
We had a short show today, man.
Yeah, we're over an hour. We got to go to the Champagne room. We got to go to we have to put the rest of this conversation behind a paywall. The revolution may charge admission.
Just as we criticize capitalism.
There is a super chat. I am brown and do not trust whites who claim interest in flashpoint race issues without any evidence of interest beforehand. This seems to be the majority of white racial activism. What are the panel's thoughts on this? We will answer this question.
Okay, that's fair. I don't trust bourgeois Negroes who say they care about Black people. So, I mean,
But what if they hugged a Black person as they said it?
I mean, that's actually what I wanted to get to Cedric about. What you're saying is well, some Black. I said, listen. We are. Besides Jason, both of us come from kind of middle to upper middle class or working class kind of backgrounds. We're degreed, we're pedigree, and obviously we have a politics that are interested in mobilizing working class Black folk. So, I mean, anyone who's a student of left political history in the world, I mean, Fidel Castro did not come from the proletariat. Neither did Mandela. Neither did Che. So obviously, there are Amilcar Cabral. These men were middle class. They were petit bourgeois. So there's no question, of course, that there's a possibility for petit bourgeois figures to become radicals, revolutionaries, leftists, or even progressive. I would argue at this stage, after being so far from movement politics, that you're going to have to show me some bona fides before you do that, and it's going to require something like what I like about Amilcar Cabral, which is class suicide or class traitorism. And until that point, I'm going to assume otherwise. And I will not give you the benefit of the doubt because there's too many examples in history of just like Borjave is worrying about the treachery of whites. I can point to as many examples of Black elite treachery of neutralization of Black working class radical formations.
Well, and on that note, Cedric, thank you oh so much for taking the time to talk with us. The conversation's finna get very spicy in the champagne room, as I'm gonna double down on your football analogy and make
I think y'all should change it to the boom boom room.
Yeah, I think that might neutralize about 50% of the population.
And anyone that is interested in Cedric's new book, wherever you're watching the show, there should be links in the description to the Versa website so you can check it out. Thank you, Cedric. On behalf of Pascal, we are out.